Talking to Jim Starlin, noted comic creator, both writer and artist. Mr. Starlin, how are you doing?
Doing fine. Caught in the middle of this Arctic vortex that's coming down, freezing like everybody else.
Yeah. I can't remember. Do you live up in Michigan?
No, I live in New York State.
Okay, that's still pretty bad.
Area.
Yeah, I'm down in Alabama, and I mean, even down here, it is freezing. Like there are mud puddles that are.
It's got that far down.
Yeah, it's like there are mud puddles that are covered in ice.
Yeah, I'm looking at the very same thing out this window, but I'm a little bit more used to it than I think you are.
Yeah, well, honest, and I can still say I still prefer the cold to the summer winter we had last year, where it was actually warm outside in January.
Yeah?
It's just kind of creepy when it's so warm outside and leaves are dead.
Yeah, we don't have that around here at all. When we don't have leaves at all at this point.
All right, I guess the first thing I want to ask you about is, how did you first get into comics as an artist?
Well, when I was about 8 years old, my dad, he worked for the Chrysler Corporation. He was a draftsman. And one of his benefits was, at the end of the day, to jam as much tracing paper, number 2 pencils, and masking tape into his briefcase as he could carry home, which he planned to use for his carpentry hobby. I found that it was great for tracing off comic book characters in the old Superman and Batman comics, and that's how I sort of learned to draw. Went through as, growing up from there into the service, in which case I started sending samples into Marvel and DC both. Eventually, DC bought a couple of my 2-page horror stories I was sending into House of Mystery, and that was all the incentive I needed. I got out of the service, packed up my bags, and headed to New York, and been working in comics off and on ever since.
When you were in the service, how did that affect your later working in comics? Or creatively?
Well, it was kind of later. It was nice not to have to hide what I was doing as much as I did in the service. It was kind of strange trying to draw comics while I was still serving in different places. One of my later jobs was an outfit called Pick Back Fack, and it was kind of easy there because we were allowed to have an extra box for storage and stuff like that, and I created a drawing board inside this plywood box that I had created with a light on it, and had this very surreptitious little drawing table I used to work on in the service. Once I got out, it was quite freeing to just be able to draw wherever I wanted.
What was your first job working at Marvel?
My first job was a love story written by Gary Friedrichs and inked by Jack Abel. It was about 3 characters: Tom the truck driver, Dick the dude, and Wendy the waitress. Alliteration went crazy in that particular job.
All right. Now, eventually, you were. Was Warlock your first big break in comics?
No, I did Captain Marvel before then. My first full issue of anything was an Iron Man issue, in which I introduced Drax the Destroyer and Thanos. My first time out, I hit a home run, and it's been going downhill ever since then. I did another issue of Iron Man after that with Steve Gerber, which Stan hated. Both of us got fired off the book. Roy Thomas, who was the actual editor at the time, asked me if I wanted to do Captain Marvel, a book which they figured wasn't going to last much longer. So I started on that. That worked out pretty well, and when I eventually got off Captain Marvel, only then did I take on Warlock. He was sort of my coming back to Marvel from a short stint at DC.
Let me ask, now, Moondragon, that was one of your characters, wasn't it?
Well, sort of. Originally, she was named Madame McKeevel, and I believe Mike Friedrichs and George Tuska created her originally. I came along later on and gave her the Moondragon thing from some album that I had. We didn't want to. I remember Roy Thomas wanted a new name, and we had to come up with a new name, and I sort of played with her for by then. But I didn't really create her wholly. I have to give Mike Friedrichs and George Tuska credit on that one.
Right, because I noticed that she made an appearance in an issue of Daredevil that Steve Gerber wrote.
Yeah, that was a 2-pager which I did up with her origin, and it was originally supposed to go in the Captain Marvel, but it didn't fit, and he was using her in Daredevil, and Steve and I were friends, and he asked if he could use those 2 pages, so that it just sort of got inserted into a story, which I guess Captain Marvel was a guest star in it or something, but
yeah,
it's a long time ago, I don't quite remember.
Now, how did you approach Captain Marvel, or how much, because I imagine if you were probably doing Spider-Man, or like you said, Iron Man, there'd probably be more editorial constraints, but with Captain Marvel, did you have more freedom working on him?
Oh, yeah. Captain Marvel was on its way to cancellation, and Roy Thomas was very upfront about that right off the bat, and so I figured that was, exactly what I wanted to work on, because Roy was the editor of all the books up there. He had to, edit, 60 books a month or something. I mean, some ridiculous amount. It wasn't that much. It was 30-some books. They hadn't got assistant editors in at that point. And so Roy just basically asked me for a 1-sentence synopsis, which I delivered at his door, and then I went off and drew it. The same thing pretty well held true for Warlock when we first started up, but then Roy eventually quit, and the editors that followed wanted to get more and more control over the book that they figured was out of control because it was too weird for the rest of the books. And
yeah.
so that's how I ended up eventually quitting Warlock, too.
Yeah, I remember, because I was reading Essential Warlock, and finally I got it last year, and the Roy Thomas issues, I read those, and those were really good. After that, it felt like the book before you came on, it never seemed to find a real direction. It was just a very strange book.
Yeah, well, it was a strange book when I was on it.
Yeah.
The editors that followed Roy weren't all that comfortable with having it. Len and Marv weren't too bad, but Jerry Conway came in, and the things he wanted to change, I just quit on the book at that point.
Now, how did you approach, when you got Warlock to write, what did you want to do with the character, and what did you think of the previous direction the character was going in?
Let's answer the first part of that first. I was always fascinated by Adam Warlock. I love Gil Kane's artwork on it. I thought Roy's take on it, doing the sort of Jesus Christ superstar, was kind of neat. It sort of, as it went along, and other writers came in and left on it, and I think it ended up getting finished off inside a Hulk series.
Yeah.
That kind of, the Jesus Christ superstar part of it sort of lost its appeal and lost its way, and like everybody else, I sort of lost interest in it. Going back to where I wanted to go with it, I have to go back even farther than Captain Marvel, because when I was doing Captain Marvel, I wanted to do some enlightenment. I wanted to do an enlightenment story, and basically when I did Captain Marvel, I took him from being a warrior to sort of a Messiah-type, cosmically aware, mystical type of character. And so when I left that book and took on Warlock, which, I finally had to sit down and look at it and realize that Warlock was where I had taken Captain Marvel. So I left Captain Marvel and I went off and I started doing the same book. So he had to go someplace else. So from my trip with him was to take a Messiah and turn him into a suicidal paranoid schizophrenic, which is basically what Adam Warlock was all about.
when did you get the ideal to do the Magus and the Universal Church of Truth?
The exact moment I couldn't tell you, but it all steers back to when I was a kid. I was raised Catholic. My grade school education was sort of parochial school. Sisters of Mercy were my teachers. Some of the teachers I had were good in this Catholic school, and some of them were complete lunatics. I had John Birchers, who preached against John F. Kennedy being president because he was going to destroy the class structure within this country. I mean, it was just a weird education for a kid. So basically, the Universal Church is basically the Catholic Church. My version of the Catholic Church in Warlock. The Magus is basically Latin for wise men, which is the appropriation for Warlock. So, you know, it all sort of fit in with a lifetime's of experience and just going and picking and choosing where I was going to take that story. That's pretty much the way I work with all my stories.
It was funny, I was, last year I officiated a wedding, and I went to that online church, and they call it the Universal Church of Life, and every time I see it, I always tell people that I'm a member of the Adam Warlock Church.
Yes. A life imitating art.
Yeah, it's just funny, because I always say, if anybody gets that reference, they'll be my best friend. Now, at some point, you went over to DC and you did some Superman stories in DC Comics Presents, and that was where you created Mongol. Was it a big deal for you to work on Superman?
Yes, it was a lot of fun. I was also working with the legendary editor Julie Schwartz, which I had never done before. It was also kind of a fun experience because I always thought that they had never really tried to push the science fiction part of Superman all that much, and which they hadn't, aside from the Legion of Superheroes going into the future and stuff like that. There was very little space stuff going on with Superman. It was the rare story where he got sort of science fiction-y, and usually, it was for one issue and then back to it. I wanted to do more of a grand epic, and I think I've succeeded fairly well at it. It keeps coming back into print, so must have done something right on it. And plus, Mongol's still around, even though DC won't let me use Mongol anymore. He's a Green Lantern character.
Yeah, do you feel like at points over the years they've taken liberties with Mongol?
Well, I wasn't there like with Thanos to sort of guide it, coming back every so often and doing a Thanos series. So where Mongol's gone is where Mongol has gone. You work for a company and you work as work for hire. You have to expect that there'll be changes, and Mongol is where he's at now. There's been some fine stories. Alan Moore did a terrific story with Mongol and Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman. There have been a couple other ones. He does seem to be kind of a mindless rager these days, but, I don't really follow those books all that closely, so I'm probably not the one to judge.
How would you differentiate Mongol and Thanos' characters?
Thanos is much more sophisticated, more the schemer. He's more successful, for one thing, in his schemes. Also, Thanos has developed as a character more than Mongol ever has. Thanos is a being like Adam Warlock, sort of outside the reality of the rest of the universe. Whenever one of these big cosmic crises arise, Thanos is always brought in as one of the key players in it. So, apples and oranges, Thanos and Mongol are two different creatures these days. They started off a lot alike, but they're different mummies. They're different creatures now.
Here's something I've been meaning to ask you this. The character Nebula, she always said she was Thanos' granddaughter. In your mind, was she actually his granddaughter, or was she just somebody that was just kind of bullshitting about it?
I think she was bullshitting about it. Why would a character who worships death and calls himself Thanos want to sire children? That was something that came up during one of my times that I was away, and when I came in and handled Nebula inside the Infinity Gauntlet, Thanos and everybody else treated her as a mad woman who was making this claim, and it was untrue.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing to say, because she says she's his granddaughter, but you never actually see her parents.
No. I just figured as some writer who, I don't even know who created her, to tell you the truth. She just was a bad idea that stuck around for a while.
Yeah, well, I mean...
put her into the Infinity Gauntlet just so I could say that she's not his daughter, or granddaughter, or whatever she was supposed to be.
Well, I always had this interesting idea that in a superhero universe, obviously you wouldn't do it in the real world because, you don't want to dilute the brands, but you would probably have, 10 people claiming to be Spider-Man at any given time.
Yeah.
Or trying to be Batman. They're like, oh, yeah, I'm Batman. Batman's like my dad or something. You'd probably have a ton of these people running around because it's not like they could copyright their identities in this world.
Well, look what we have with stalkers, celebrity stalkers, and, we do have a lot of people who pretend that they are other folks, so, I remember one story here in New York City where, this fellow got along quite a long time in New York City, getting invited to parties and help getting loans from people because he claimed he was Sidney Poitier's son, and, he went quite a ways pulling that one off.
If I can go back to when you went back to Marvel, now there were a couple of stories, and again, I'm sorry I haven't been able to, I read these, it's been a while since I read them, but when the second story where Adam Warlock came back, it was the story when Thanos was turned to stone, and he pretty much went away for about a decade. Do you remember how that came about?
That was at the end of the Avengers 2-in-1 annuals. It was the first time Warlock and Thanos met, actually. Thanos kills Warlock in that story, and at the end, Warlock's spirit turns him into stone. He doesn't show up again until at the end of the death of Captain Marvel, in which case we see that, he's living in the domain of death and has been hanging out with Mistress Death all this time.
Right. In the story, Spider-Man kind of plays a role in it. I've noticed that you use Spider-Man a bit in, an Infinity Abyss. He turned up as a character. Can you tell me why you liked using Spider-Man in these stories?
Well, Spider-Man was the first character I actually did work on over at Marvel. John Romita Sr. was the penciler on Spider-Man at the time when I first came up there, and John was always late on his deadline, so some of my first work was doing layouts for John to catch up on his deadlines with that. I think I did about 3 or 4 issues, and I got credit on some of the later issues, a couple of the later issues I remember, but basically I did thumbnails, and then John came in and half the time ignored it, but sometimes you could look in there and see my artwork in it, but it was an inconsistent kind of collaboration, I must say.
When you would do artwork and you were writing too, did you write a script ahead of time, or would you just draw it out and then script it?
Most of the time, to this very day, I will script it after or during the art. What I'm doing is, a lot of times on this new work I'm doing up at Marvel for the Thanos, the Revelation, and this Thanos Annual, and this, now I'm working on a Savage Hulk story arc that has Thanos in it. And, I may script up a little loose script before I get started. I work on thumbnails first, and then I may do up a loose script, but I won't turn in a script until after the pencils, just so I can play with them. The words are right up until the last moment.
All All right. One big thing I wanted to ask you about was, in addition to your Marvel work, which with Thanos and Warlock, that's your most famous work, probably. You had a run on Batman in the late 1980s.
Yes.
And the one thing I wanted to ask you about was the KG Beast, because I read 10 Nights of the Beast, and that's like one of my... I think that's probably the last great Batman villain that was created.
Well, thank you. Your question about him is what?
Oh, I was just wondering how you came up with him, and I just wanted to know how you came up with that storyline and how you came up with the villain.
Came up with the name first, as I recall. Russia, communist Russia was still around at the time, and I was listening to some documentary and on the radio, and they talked about the KGB, and the static hit just as the B came along, and I heard KG Beast. And from there, I just started building a story around it. I was reading a lot of, Andrew Vox and Elmore Leonard, and a lot of crime stuff at that point. And I guess it was sort of built up, it got built up around that. I understand the KG Beast is going to be a villain on the Arrow TV show this year.
Oh, well, that's great to hear. I always...
I'm kind of curious to see how they handle him.
Now, because you'll know, and I'm sure you're aware of this, it felt like after the initial storyline, they never used the KG Beast well again, which always bothered me, because I don't understand why the Cold War ending would prevent him from being dangerous. But, did you ever, were you disappointed he wasn't used better, or is it a case like Mongol, where once it's out of your hands, you just have to let it go?
Well, with Mongol, I would occasionally see what they did with him, but the KG Beast, I have no idea. I've never read another story since then. They don't always send you to bundles, and I'm sure they did KG Beast stories that that just never got around to sending me, so I have no comment on him whatsoever.
It was just mainly cameos, like they had him get beat up by Bane in a Bane one-shot before Nightfall.
Okay, never saw those.
Yeah. Now the point in the story when Batman actually manages to capture the Beast, and I thought it was an interesting story because I don't think you've ever really had a story where someone was just outsmarting Batman at every turn. At the point, when did you come up with the ideal of him cutting off his own hand?
I think I probably had that in my head from animals that gnaw their legs off to get away. I understand that there was some movie that had something similar go on, but I think it was basically from the animal just chewing his leg off to get away from out of a snare trap.
When you're doing something like Batman or even Superman, do the editors encourage you to use the established villains, or do they want you to create your own, or is there a mixture of it?
It's a mix, most of the time when editors come to me, they just say, can you do something with this character? And I'll go from there. When an editor sits there and tries to tell me what the story should be, I usually walk away because, you're supposed to be hiring me because I'm the creative force. I'm not some Waldo that you can stick your hands on and do the story that they want to do. If editors want to write their own stories, they should write their own stories. Right.
Now, the other big Batman story you did, and I'm sure you get asked about this probably almost as much as you do stuff about Thanos, is when Jason Todd was killed.
Right.
When
be a lot of free beers down in Mexico at the time it happened.
When exactly, now, you wanted to kill, because I remember when I was talking to you in May, you wanted to kill...
Bookkeeping department was having trouble acknowledging that I actually existed, and there were long periods where I wasn't getting paid for the work I was doing.
Okay, Jim, I'm sorry, I was having problems with my digital recorder about halfway through that.
Okay, probably just as well.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was trying to get everything ready this morning, and I hadn't had to change you have to change AAA batteries maybe once a year.
Right.
Anyway, but yeah, let me go back to that. So when you were doing what came up, why did Marvel resist doing a Thanos series for so long?
Well, why did they resist doing the Thanos series?
Well, it seemed like, yeah.
I don't think there was ever much of resistance. It just didn't occur to anybody. Thanos was a villain. Thanos was very successful in different things like the Infinity Gauntlet and whatever series he was in, but doing a sustained series on a villain is difficult. They did one with Doctor Doom back in the 70s somewhere, and I can't remember who was writing it, but it sort of floundered very quickly. They had no idea what to do with it. Looks like the Thanos quests are kind of an exception rather than a rule. Most writers don't want to go into those really dark spots where you have to go if you're going to write somebody like Thanos. It's an uncomfortable place to be. I find it, very useful, but I know from other folks that they're much more happy. They're much more comfortable writing the villains, the heroes and the villains. I'm just the opposite. I always find the villains much more interesting to deal with, and I'd rather be playing with them.
Well, I kind of noticed something, because I've been reading, I read a lot of comics, usually old ones lately, and I can't help but notice whenever you'll see a comic with a really original premise, it seems like as soon as the creator's gone and somebody else comes on the book, that they try to make it into something much more traditional.
Well, it's a company. It's people, the creative forces that created Spider-Man aren't there anymore. Stan and Steve Ditko have long been off the book. So what you're getting now is whoever is available that they think will write an interesting book. These aren't the creative forces that started it. These are sort of watered down copies that you get of the original. The original is always better. Look at those early Fantastic Fours with Jack Kirby and Stan.
Yeah.
Those are magic. It never was as good as it was those first 100 issues.
Yeah, it's kind of like something similar, it's like I was reading about Howard Hughes, and even one of his most minor inventions, anybody else could have lived off that for the rest of their life as being their calling card.
Yeah, but he wasn't satisfied. He had to do something more.
Right.
So I probably could have retired some time back here and been comfortable up here in the Catskills, but I like drawing and writing, so I put up with the nonsense of work just because I love what I'm doing. I'm sure Howard Hughes was the same way. He just loved creating and being able to accomplish things. So I can understand that.
Yeah, that's what I was getting. When you look at those first 100 issues of Fantastic Four, like in a span of 10 issues, they did the Inhumans, Galactus, and it's like, I think people kind of take that for granted now, just how much stuff they created in just such a short span of time.
Yeah, that was Jack's favorite book, I think, and I think it was the best thing, followed closely by his run on the Thor, but the Fantastic Four were his most creative, outlet, clearly.
Let me ask you about something, because this reminded me, is that they did the storyline where Warlock was created as him. Years later, in I think Marvel 2-in-1, they decided to do a female version of Warlock.
Yes, I think her name was.
Right. Did you ever have any interest in working on that character?
It seems like I did something where... No, I didn't really have any interest in that. It seems like she showed up in one story somewhere briefly, but I can't remember at this point.
Yeah, she shows up...
30 years ago.
She didn't show up too often. Like, she would show up in the 80s a couple of times. I think the most she was ever used was probably Mark Grunwald's Quasar run.
Right, and I think she showed up in something, one of our, I had a coloring company for a while when the coloring on computers first started up. For a short while, I had some folks that I worked with, and I think we did a story where she was in. That's what I was thinking of, but none of my own work, my personal work, did I ever do anything with her.
Oh, when it came time for Infinity Gauntlet, when did the ideal come? Was Infinity Gauntlet originally just be a Silver Surfer storyline?
Well, the Infinity Gauntlet goes way back to, the Soul Gem with Warlock. I mean, that was his Soul Gem. In the Avengers 2-in-1 Annual, that's when we first learned that there are other Infinity Gems. And Thanos is busy gathering them, but we don't really know what they are. They just sort of developed as they went along. The Gauntlet, basically, that's when they decided they wanted to do a Thanos story, because the Silver Surfer booklet with him in it had been selling really well. And so they said, let's do a Thanos story, a one-shot. And then when the one-shot came in and the orders on it started coming in really big, they said, well, if we're going to follow this up, because my original idea was I was just going to go back to the Surfer and finish off the story. And they said, well, this book is selling really well, the Thanos Quest has sold well, let's build this into something bigger, and that's how the Infinity Gauntlet sort of came to be. The funny thing about it was, I was supposed to get all these characters to use, and at the time, none of the editors wanted me to use their characters in the Infinity Gauntlet. The X-Men people were very down about it. In fact, we were only able to use 2 X-Men, and most of the editors didn't want to do any crossovers with it. But then the book came out, and not only did Infinity Gauntlet sold well, but anything that had the Infinity Gauntlet crossover sold well. So when we got to the Infinity War, which was the next one, I suddenly had to use everybody in the Marvel Universe. Everybody wanted to be involved in it. One from one extreme to the other. It was pretty crazy.
If you mind if I ask you something, I was able to get a hold of an Infinity War poster, one of the big promo posters they made. Do you know who did the art on it?
So the painting?
Yeah. It kind of looks like, it looks like a painting. It's got Galactus in the shadows.
Yeah, it's me. I painted that. Yeah.
Oh, it's wonderful. It's in my room. It's like I paid, I think I paid about $20 for it because I wanted it so bad.
Okay, well, glad you liked it.
Yeah. Now with
it was done. It was painted the size of the poster. Actually, it was an enormous monster.
Yeah, it was well worth it. It's one of my favorite things I have, because I've been collecting posters for like years now. Ever since I got my own home, I just plaster it with all sorts of posters. Let me ask you about this, because after Infinity Gauntlet ended, Infinity Watch began. Did you want to do a regular series like that?
Once again, the books were selling so well that they wanted more books of the same, and so the storyline with Warlock surrendering, I couldn't keep Warlock as the supreme being of the Marvel Universe. They already had a couple of creatures for that. So the idea was to eventually get rid of the Infinity Gems to somebody else, and the idea of bringing it into a group, these characters were just sitting around, nobody was doing anything with them, and I created most of them, and I just loved them, so I decided to put them together in the book, and it was a very successful series for a while there.
Yeah. I remember the first issue. That's one of those comics that, again, when I was a kid, I couldn't get comics whenever I wanted. I found that in one of these grab bags, and I just loved that comic so much, and it worked so well, even as an epilogue to Infinity Gauntlet, just ideal that I remember I liked the idea of the Living Tribunal just saying that Warlock was probably more dangerous with supreme power than Thanos.
Yeah.
It's like, Thanos just going to kill a bunch of people.
Angel Medina artwork. Angel did a terrific job on that art.
I remember, I just like the idea that, Thanos is just going to kill a bunch of people, but then he's probably not going to do anything. Warlock, he's going to really mess stuff up.
Yeah, well, Warlock came with a different perspective, which is probably scarier in the long run for a creature like Eternity or the Living Tribunal, and the fact that Thanos could be more or less predictable, is kind of predictable at what he does. On the other hand, Warlock, you never know what he's going to do next.
It was interesting how you wrote Eternity, because from his first appearance in Doctor Strange, he always had the high and mighty Eternity, almost like he was above it all, but when it came to dealing with Thanos with the Infinity Gauntlet and Warlock, he almost came across like a child when a new baby's born.
Well, that was basically the relationship between that. I mean, he was the highest, the high, and got used to that. Unquestioned authority, and to suddenly have it questioned, I found it much more interesting to have him resisting the change, where Infinity didn't. Eternity was much more adamant about going against Warlock and Thanos.
Now, I asked you this back at the convention. Can Eternity hear prayers?
Could you say that again?
Can he hear prayers?
I'm not sure that your prayers would be directed toward him. He is like all of time. Infinity is all of space. I think the one above them is the Living Tribunal. And I think he even serves somebody higher than that. So if you're sending prayers off someplace, I think it goes, they would be not going to any one of those three characters.
Now, over time, were there ever points, because you weren't really drawing during this period, can you tell me why?
Just so much writing to be done. I was writing novels. The drawing that I was doing to illustrate the novels. I was just working on different things. It was just a period there where the writing was much easier. There was so much of it that I couldn't have kept up with it in the drawing anyhow, so we had to have other people drawing it.
What were the names of the novels you did?
Among Madmen was the first. Lady L, that's Lady E.L., was the second. The third one was called Thinning the Predators, and later on it was released in softcover as Predators. And in between there was a serialized novel in the back of First Comics Dreadstar called Pawns.
Later on, you did do more art. You worked with Alan Moore on Supreme at one point.
Just one issue.
Right. How was that?
Long after Alan had left the book, and actually I only did 18 of the 20 pages. The end of it, Alan had left whatever the publisher's name was, and
it was Rob Liefeld.
They lost the last 2 pages. It took them a while, and by that time I was off to doing something else, so the last 2 pages aren't really my drawings or anything like that.
Okay, I found that book in a quarter box, and I'm always excited to find a comic of yours, especially if it's cheap, so I remember I grabbed it right up.
Yeah, I always liked Alan Moore's work, and I thought this was going to be a great opportunity to work with him on that, and little did I know that I wasn't going to get the whole job, and that Alan had long ago left and was doing other things.
Now, at one point, I was curious if you knew about this, Marvel bought Malibu in the mid-90s, and they did a crossover using the Infinity Gems, and somehow they were once one being. In your mind, was that story canon when you came back to them?
I never read it, so I had no idea. I knew that they had done something with it, but there was all this legal problems with the Malibu stuff where they couldn't use the characters that they had thought they had bought. And so I just ignored everything that went on over there, and I never even saw the issues.
Yeah, I came across one or two of them. I kept meaning to ask. I was just meaning to ask about that. Another thing you did was in the '70s. You created Shang-Chi. You and was it Doug Monet, or I can't pronounce his name.
Steve Englehart.
Steve Englehart. Okay, yeah. Can you tell me about that?
Basically, Steve Englehart and I were fans of the TV show Kung Fu. And we wanted to do a comic book adaptation of that, except it was a Warner Brothers product, and DC Comics didn't want to do it, and so we decided to do the next best thing over at Marvel. Started designing it up. Steve and I would talk over what the character was going to be. Then Stan came along, and he had bought the rights to Fu Manchu, and so Fu Manchu was drafted onto the project. I did up pencils for the first issue, and then ran into Larry Hama, who was a cartoonist who worked at the Continuity at the time, and he asked me if I had ever read any of the Fu Manchu books, and I, told him no, and he said, well, you should sit down and read any one of them, and he went off, and I think he got me one. And that night I sat down and was just horrified by what I found out. I had no idea that Fu Manchu books were such racist pieces of shit. Every other sentence is yellow menace or something against blacks it was just, I was embarrassed. I had already done this first issue and there was nothing much I could do. So, I said, I'm going to have to live with this. I laid out 2 more issues, got off the book, and have been trying to forget it ever since.
Yeah. So and it's interesting, the ideal Fu Manchu in the Marvel Universe, because I had this ideal of a character that was, a character that was he was like a Yellow Peril pulp character, but in a world full of Doctor Dooms, he couldn't really get noticed.
Yeah, I think it had its place in time playing on the white fears of, the beginning of the last century, whenever those books were put out. I guess it was somewhere in the 20s and 30s. We were coming off World War II. We were heading toward World War II, I believe, when those things were written. They were just kind of uncomfortable, they didn't use terms like mud people or anything, but they were the same kind of...
It's an undercurrent.
Stuff that, gets written now by these, white supremacist groups. And, that's not where I'm at, and
yeah.
I don't want to have anything to do with it.
Yeah, and then Marvel now, they can't use the character because whenever they use Shang-Chi, so... I think they said something that they tried to tease bringing him back even though they couldn't show him, and the thing I always wondered is that I can't believe the character's not in public domain, because I can't imagine that anybody's actually making money off of it now.
I think the family still owns some kind of rights to the character itself, but the books, you could reprint if you wanted to, Fu Manchu books, but I think there's still... Yeah, you don't really... They still have some ownership of the character itself.
Yeah, and it's at this point, nobody really wants to, because like you said, there's a very racial undercurrent.
Yeah, it'd be too uncomfortable to do anything with Fu Manchu at this point. Not that anybody really wants to.
Yeah. Let me go a little further. Eventually, you came back to Marvel and you did the Thanos stories with Infinity Abyss. Can you tell me what brought about Infinity Abyss?
Let me think on the Abyss for a moment. We had done so well. I was just coming back to Marvel at that point. I had been away for a while. And with the Infinity Abyss, it was just sort of jumping in and doing the more cosmic characters and Spider-Man. It was sort of more... The Abyss is probably the weakest of all the Infinity books, actually. I don't really recall where I wanted to go with it other than I wanted to play with these characters again. Later on, Marvel the End and the Thanos series, I had much better directions on it. The Abyss was basically let's come back and play with these characters I hadn't played with in years.
One of the things you did was it introduced the Thanosy, the clones he created, and you told me that, I remember back in May you were mentioning how that was partly done to explain some of Thanos' lesser appearances during the 90s.
Yes. Okay, now I'm remembering, yes. There was some damage control on the image of Thanos that I want to correct. As it turns out, one of the most egregious, I mentioned earlier about Larry Lieber having Thanos robbing banks in a Spidey story. But there was also one there was a Kazar story.
Yeah.
And I didn't really know this whole thing at the time, but apparently it was supposed to be Kazar versus some X-Men villain.
Right.
Big X-Men villain. It may have been Apocalypse or something.
Yeah, something like that.
They told Mark you had to change it. So the book has already been drawn up and everything, and so they said, use this Thanos character. And basically it was Thanos fighting Kazar, and Kazar, as I recall, actually succeeds in fairly beating up Thanos. And so I figured there had to be some kind of explanation for these things, and that's where the clone stories, where crazy Thanos developed up a bunch of different Thanoses that he could use in different situations for some insane reasoning that he had at the moment. Even he is kind of embarrassed by it when he comes back and visits it a decade later and goes, I don't know what I was thinking.
I thought the use of the Thanos and the Thor story, I really appreciated how well you used that story to build forward. To build more stories around it. The idea that this one crazy Thanos clone actually did a lot of damage.
Yes. It was the one John Romita Jr. and them were doing. Yes, that was one of the better ones that they actually had of Thanos while I was away.
Yeah, I remember there was this line about how Thanos just mentioned how Thor was so proud of it, and he seemed amused by the ideal himself.
Yeah, like I said, I didn't do those particular Thor stories, so I don't have much to comment on.
Yeah. After Infinity Abyss, eventually there was the Marvel The End story that I think was reprinted as Thanos The End. What were you, when did you, because originally these stories, I know the End stories were supposed to be non-canon. When did you realize it was going to actually be in continuity?
Well, okay, I'll have to admit to a mistake. I never understood the concept of the End books. They hadn't had any of them out. I think the Fantastic Four one done by the Fantastic Four book. I forget the name of the artist.
Alan Davis.
Who did a really nice job. I never saw that, so I had no idea that the conceit was it's supposed to be the last issue. And nobody told me. I turned in the plot, and nobody said, well, what we really want is this. They just ran with it and said, okay, do it, and only afterwards did I realize that I was doing something that was different than the rest of them. I didn't intend to do it that way. I just didn't understand what I was supposed to be delivering.
Do you think you would have done how would you have approached the story differently if you'd known that it was, you would have had no boundaries?
By that time I learned that I had messed up. I was so far into it that there was never any time to give that any thought. And I don't know what I would have done differently at this point.
It's a wonderful story. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with it. I mean, the world leaders that I was being able to pull in there. There was a lot more fun with that than the Abyss, actually.
It's funny, I told you this in Nashville, but the only thing that ever took me out of the book was you having to draw those hideous X-Men costumes.
Never was a big X-Men fan. I'm still not.
Like, that was when they were having to wear striped sweaters and leather pants.
Yeah, that was just after one of the movies movies came out, and so they redesigned all the characters up so they didn't look like superheroes anymore. They looked like the things in the movies, and they were just they took a while to draw.
Yeah. When did you get the idea to bring in a new player into the story with the Pharaoh?
Oh, I've always been a big Egypt fan, and Akhenaten has been a favorite pharaoh of mine. I used an offshoot of him. There's various different ways his name is spelled throughout the years, throughout the decades. Different researches. In one version, he's an Akhenaten is inside the Dreadstar series, the Metamorphosis Odyssey, at the beginning of that. So this new one was just another opportunity. I needed a powerful character. I wanted to hit it from a different perspective, and so I just went back and had him originating from ancient Egypt so that I could draw a lot of ancient Egypt motif. It was completely self-indulgent creating that character.
Yeah, it was. I always like that type of thing in a story where sometimes you'll just have a brand new player appear from left field and knock everybody for a loop.
Yeah, that was what he was supposed to be, the catalyst which allowed Thanos to once again gain power and do what he had to do in the story. So, he was a bit of a throwaway, but he was a throwaway that lasted like about 4 issues, I think.
There was one panel at the end of the series, this might have been in the last issue, where Thanos went back to the farm he had at the end of Infinity Gauntlet, and he's kind of just sitting on the porch with his head in his hands.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I was just wondering how did you come up with that image? Because to me, it was such a powerful character, just having such a human moment.
I think it came from the fact that, I now live in the woods myself. I'm not around cities or anything like that. I visit cities, but, I enjoy being away from it. And I think the story of him coming to the decision where he wanted to just take it as easy as he could was, the most logical place to be taking him.
All right. Now you have a Marvel series coming out later this year.
Okay, let's talk on that real quickly, but because I have another interview coming up at 3. We've been on this.
I'm sorry. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I was just.
Let me say yes. I have 3 new Thanos things coming out for Marvel this summer. One of them is Thanos: The Infinity Revelation, which is a 100-page graphic novel that I wrote and drew, and has been inked by Andy Smith. And it brings back Warlock. It has the Annihilators in it. And at the end of the story, there's a major change in Thanos. His status within the Marvel Universe has changed. All 3 of these projects, the second one is there'll be a Thanos annual, which I am only writing, and Mark Bagley is supposed to be drawing it. It also will be out somewhere around June or July. And the third project is I'm doing a 4-issue story arc in a new book called The Savage Hulk that will be coming out. And it features Thanos and Annihilus as guest stars within that series, that story.
All right.
So those are the 3 things that will be coming out this summer.
All right. Jim, thank you very much for talking to me. Yeah, I was asking about that because my sister has been trying to bug me for about 30 minutes about watching her baby. Yeah, and I had to set up this today. I had to go through 3 people to get the time away because she gets into everything, and I wouldn't be able to talk to you if she was here.
Okay, well, I'm glad we had this chance to talk. Wish we could have done it later, but like another 15 minutes, I got to start in on it again, I'm afraid.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much for talking to me. It's something I'll always appreciate.
Okay, well, you take care, and send me a link to your podcast when you get the chance.
I sure will. I certainly will. You have a good day.